The Battle of York, April the 27th, 1813, 210 years ago today. Greetings, dear listeners. For today's video, I will be largely relying on the excellent maps and timelines for the Battle of York found in Richard Feltoe's book, The Pendulum of War, The Fight for Upper Canada, January to June 1813, part of his 6-volume series, Upper Canada Preserved, which I will review in a future video. Thanks, Richard. Other works consulted include Pierre Burton's The Flames of War and Alan Taylor's The Civil War of 1812. In early 1813, new U.S. Secretary of War John Armstrong envisioned a two-pronged attack against Canada, the objectives being the seizure of both Kingston and Niagara. However, news that Kingston had been heavily reinforced led the Americans to shift to a secondary target, York, capital of Upper Canada and today's Toronto. The invasion fleet assembled at Sackett's Harbor, New York, on April 20th and was ready to shove off 3 days later. But the weather turned decidedly stormy. Here's a quote from Feltoe. Quote, "Overruling the advice of his naval commanders, Dearborn ordered the heavily overburdened American fleet to set sail, only to encounter a severe storm that forced the ships to come about and run back to Sackett's Harbor for sheltering." End of quote. Some sheltering. For 2 days the troops are trapped below decks. And those are the lucky ones. The unlucky ones are on deck in the cold rain. Finally, the weather clears on the 25th, and they set sail, arriving off York on the 26th. They will invade on the 27th. In charge of the naval forces, Commodore Isaac Chauncey. In charge of the invasion force, Brigadier General Zebulon Pike. Zebulon Pike, a noted explorer. Pike's Peak is named after him. Overall commander, Major General Henry Dearborn. Their opponent, in command of British and Canadian forces, Major General Sir Roger Hale Sheaffe, Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada. For a detailed order of battle, please see the Wikipedia article on the Battle of York, link in description. In order to describe the battle in a concise manner, I'm adopting the timelines found in the Feltoe book, The Pendulum of War. April 27th, 1813, 5:30 to 8 a.m. The Americans arrive off York, but strong winds push them west, away from York Bay and towards the open waters off Humber Bay, beyond the range of the artillery at Fort York and of the detached batteries, Half Moon Battery and the Western Battery. General Sheaffe gathers his troops at Fort York, but, in Feltoe's words, quote, fails to establish any coordinated response to the American attack. End of quote. Instead, independent units are sent west in order to find and engage the Americans, many taking obscure woodland trails to avoid artillery fire from the enemy ships. Captain Jarvis's Incorporated Militia Artillery Detachment occupies the Western Battery. Canadian embodied militia units head north to secure the main road heading towards York, followed by the Glengarry Light Infantry, which will break away to march towards the sound of the guns. Militia under Captain Jarvie, not Jarvis, Jarvie, these are different troops, arrive at Fort York then also march west. American troops will land to the west of Fort Roulet, an old fort long abandoned by the French, and some 2 miles west of Fort York and 4 miles west of the town. Here they first encounter Ojibwe and Mississauga warriors, followed by grenadiers from the 8th or King's Regiment. Both sides will take casualties fighting in the woods that fringe the shore. Both Grenadier Captain Neil McNeil and Donald McLean, clerk of the Legislative Assembly, are killed in action, as are 2 grenadiers who drown in a large pond, known today as Grenadier Pond, in Toronto's High Park. As more Americans land, they overwhelm and scatter the defenders, who retreat towards the old French fort. Among the invaders are Major Forsyth's green-coated 1st Rifle Regiment, sharpshooters who like fighting in the woods. 8 to 9:30 a.m. The battle at Fort Roulet. American vessels continue landing troops, while others sail east, back towards York, firing at targets of opportunity. In order to halt the American advance on York, the British and Canadian units establish a line of defense in a clearing near the old French fort. When the Americans arrive, the fight is on. American ships on Lake Ontario target the defenders and fire into their flank, causing significant casualties. Overwhelmed, the British and Canadians are forced to make a fighting retreat back towards the Western Battery and Fort York. 9:30 to 11 a.m. The British and Canadians establish a new line of defense at the Western Battery. Fire from the defenders will halt the invaders' advance until an accidental explosion in the battery inflicts serious casualties and destroys the position. The British and Canadians will continue their retreat, with some units heading for Fort York, others to the town itself, while the Jarvis and Jarvie companies take shelter in the bed of the aptly named Garrison Creek, north of Fort York's Stone Magazine. As the troops are battling it out on land, the American fleet moves into York Harbor to bombard the town. 11:30 a.m. to 12 p.m. Feltoe entitles this part of the battle as "The Magazine Explodes at Fort York." Believing they have won the day, American troops form up to the west of the fort to await Sheaffe's formal surrender. Unfortunately, while this is going on, General Sheaffe, determined to prevent the Americans from taking the fort's Stone Magazine, orders it blown up. The resultant blast will knock the assembled American troops off their feet, shattering eardrums, and is even felt by the ships out on Lake Ontario, 500 yards away. Falling debris, which includes masonry, timbers, rocks, and stones, inflict serious casualties, including Brigadier General Pike, his ribs crushed by a huge boulder. Some 250 are hurt as a result of the blast, but the nearby militia, protected by their sheltering creek bed, will suffer lesser effects. Pike's reported last words, quote, "Push on, my brave fellows, and revenge your general." Some believe a British counterattack at this point might have defeated the Americans. But Sheaffe, who doesn't know about the effects of the blast, by the way, but Sheaffe determines to save his regulars to fight another day and retreats towards Kingston. As he retreats, he burns the partially completed warship Sir Isaac Brock as well as warehouses full of supplies to keep them out of American hands. Personally, I think Sheaffe probably made the right decision. And just as an aside, I note that the Americans were really angry that the regulars got away. But Sheaffe's decision doesn't sit well with the people of York, in particular the Reverend John Strawn. The Reverend's idea of a good soldier was the dashing and aggressive Brock, not the cautious and colorless Sheaffe, whose actions are more in line with those of his conservative boss, Sir George Prevost. In the end, however, the chorus of complaints by Strawn and others will lead to Sheaffe's replacement by Major General Baron Francis de Rottenburg. The Americans will occupy York until May the 2nd, during which time they famously burned the Upper Canada Parliament building, supposedly after some sailors allegedly find a human, and presumably American scalp, on display by the Speaker's chair. The invaders empty military and private warehouses and engage in widespread looting, assisted by some pro-American locals. When they eventually do leave, they take as a prize the vessel Duke of Gloucester, whilst burning the unseaworthy General Hunter. The Americans have won a moral-boosting victory, but at a serious cost, especially the death of Brigadier General Pike. But it is a victory they failed to build upon. They don't keep York and will next attack Fort George in the Niagara region. In addition, the burning of the Upper Canada Parliament sets a dangerous precedent and will ultimately lead to the burning of the White House in 1814. According to Wikipedia, the casualties are as follows: British/Canadian, 82 killed, 112 wounded, including 69 wounded prisoners, 274 captured, 7 missing. American, 55 killed, 265 wounded. As noted earlier, Richard Feltoe's The Pendulum of War also provides some excellent battlefield maps showing the action as it unfolds. I lived in Toronto for 3 years during the 1980s, and while I know vaguely where Fort York is, I think it would be great fun to tool around Toronto with Feltoe's maps, if you can stand the traffic, and see what the area looks like today. Believe it or not, most of the area was covered by forest in 1813. If anyone listening to this video tries exploring any of the locations involved in the Battle of York, please take some photos and videos and send them to me at wsjxxx@gmail.com. That's wsjxxx@gmail.com. Just be sure to put Battle of York in the subject line so I know it's not spam. If this is your first visit to 1812 channel, my name is Warren and I'm your host. I'm not a historian, nor am I an expert on the War of 1812. Instead, I'm a student wishing to learn about the conflict. Each month for the roughly 3 years of the war, I will outline the major events. I will also review a book on the war. Did I miss anything? Any errors? Then let me know in the comments below. When the barrage lifts, cheers! Strange Fatality, The Battle of Stoney Creek by James E. Elliott. Once upon a time, during a car trip to Niagara Falls, I stopped with my wife and her parents for a picnic. Looking around, I remember my father-in-law saying, "Well, well, well, A former battlefield. What better place for two married couples to have a picnic? Gosh, I miss him. We were stopped, of course, at Stoney Creek. The Battle of Stoney Creek took place at, wait for it, Stoney Creek, just east of the present-day city of Hamilton, Ontario, and actually now part of the city of Hamilton, Ontario, during the early morning hours of June the 6th, 1813. It left both armies battered and feeling defeated, but it must be regarded as a British victory, as it led to an American withdrawal. In fact, it marked the end of the current U.S. invasion. Strange Fatality is the title of James E. Elliott's recounting of the battle and its aftermath. The book's title is an expression used by the American commander, the sickly Henry Dearborn, in his report of the battle to U.S. Secretary of War John Armstrong. In his report, Dearborn tried to explain and justify the failure of his troops to pursue and destroy the British Army by claiming, quote, "By some strange fatality, both Brigadier Generals Chandler and Winder were taken prisoner." End of quote. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Elliott's book opens with the May 27th amphibious assault on Newark, now Niagara-on-the-Lake, and on nearby Fort George by the U.S. Army and Navy working in concert. The British commander, Brigadier General John Vincent, believing that he is hopelessly outnumbered, and he is, prudently decides to save his army by withdrawing east to Burlington Heights. Please review my May 1813 video for more information on the assault on Fort George. Colonel Winifred Scott tries to run down the retreating British, despite suffering from a broken collarbone, but is ordered back by his superior, Major General Morgan Lewis, who also reprimands the firebrand Scott for having chased the enemy so far afield. Thus, once again, the United States manages to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. This was the very thing that Armstrong had warned Dearborn against. Dearborn is 62 years of age, and so ill he is unable to stand without assistance. And he also dithers. In this case, nearly 2 days pass before troops, firstly under Brigadier General William Winder, then under Brigadier General John Chandler, begin to pursue the retreating British. While this had been going on, Vincent's forces had reached the Burlington Heights, where the general mulled a further retreat, this time as far as Kingston, pursued by the American advance to the very edge of their encampment and threatened by a much larger force, 1,700 British, against at least twice as many Americans. Vincent and his men no doubt felt their backs were against the wall. But the American army sets up camp for the night at, you guessed it, Stoney Creek. But Winder and Chandler neglect proper camp security, with dozens of cooking fires clearly visible in the darkness. British Lieutenant Colonel John Harvey, perhaps recalling the successful British night attack at Paoli in 1777 during the Revolutionary War, proposes a midnight assault. The British move silently through the darkness, bayonets fixed, muskets unloaded to prevent any accidental firing. They will walk through the darkness some 10 miles. All accounts of the battle talk of the complete and all-encompassing darkness of the night. Today, in our era of urbanized light pollution, it's hard to imagine how dark it could get in a pre-industrial, heavily forested area. Throughout the battle, soldiers on both sides will have trouble distinguishing friend from foe. The British managed to infiltrate the American camp, only to have a chorus of cheers from some of Vincent's staff officers destroy the element of surprise and cause the darkness to explode with noise and confusion. The U.S. forces largely stand their ground and inflict serious casualties on the attackers, but a British bayonet charge led by Major Charles Plenderleith of the 49th Regiment dislodges the American artillery and leads to the capture of both Generals Chandler and Winder, turning the tide of battle. Not that the British understand this. At first, their own general, Vincent, is also missing, and so they withdraw back to their own lines in anticipation of an American counterattack, which never comes. With the disappearance of Generals Chandler and Winder, command of American forces devolves upon Colonel James Byrne of the 2nd Light Dragoons, a brave and competent soldier, but no leader. He dithers and holds a meeting with his senior officers, where Colonel John Christie of the 13th Infantry argues that he should be in command and that the Americans should go on the attack. Byrne finally decides to retire to a previous camp at 40 Mile Creek and await further orders. A retreat that was apparently far from orderly. Not that the British side, which is still missing General Vincent, feels much better. Elliott quotes Lieutenant James Fitzgibbon of the 49th, who says, quote, "Here then we find both parties leaving the scene of the action, each believing the others the conquerors." End of quote. While these events had been unfolding, the American Naval Squadron is MIA, missing in action. Commodore Isaac Chauncey, spooked by the British raid on his base at Sackett's Harbor, New York, again see my May 1813 video, sails back to base to guard his new corvette, the 26-gun General Pike, which is still being built. As nature abhors a vacuum, into that vacuum comes a British squadron under command of the aggressive James Yeo. The arrival of the British ships spooks Henry Dearborn. In Elliott's words, Yeo was, quote, "putting the wind up Dearborn," end of quote. Despite having ordered Major General Morgan Lewis to find and destroy the British Army, an order issued only 36 hours earlier, Dearborn now orders Lewis to return to Fort George with all possible speed. Lewis received the order while skirmishing with the British at 40 Mile Creek. Lewis, who is known for traveling at a leisurely pace, does make all possible speed, racing back to the fort. In fact, he leaves so quickly, he fails to secure the train of small boats taking supplies back to Fort George, the boats then being run aground by Yeo's squadron, the crews captured by native warriors under John Norton. Once they arrive, the Americans will find themselves imprisoned in Fort George and harassed by an enemy they had initially beaten on May the 27th. An attempt to renew the offensive will end in disaster for U.S. forces at Beaverdams on June the 24th. Events I will cover when I review the booklet, The Battle of Beaverdams, the story of Thorold's battle in the War of 1812 by Donald Keith Dewar. Thorold. This was one failure too many for Henry Dearborn, who found himself cancelled by Secretary of War Armstrong. Surprisingly, to me anyway, Elliott writes that many of the officers serving under Dearborn thought the dismissal was unfair. I found Strange Fatality to be a balanced and objective account of this confusing night action. Elliott is an experienced journalist who worked for the Hamilton Spectator, where he wrote a series of articles on the War of 1812. The book is filled with mini bios of the participants on both sides, as well as bios of prominent civilian witnesses, and ends with several appendices, which cover such topics as the development of the current battlefield park and the true role of Scout Billy Green, the hero of Pierre Burton's account of Stoney Creek in The Invasion of Canada. Oh, and the Butcher's Bill? Elliott notes that the American commanders took great pains to downplay their casualty figures, and in view of the confusion, I'm going to go with Wikipedia's figures for the battle. British, 23 killed, 138 wounded, 52 captured, 3 missing. That sounds reasonable. For a time, the missing included Brigadier General Vincent, who was missing in action for some 6 to 8 hours and whose disappearance during the battle has never been adequately explained. American casualties: 17 killed, 38 wounded, and 100 captured. Oh, that's too low. Way, way too low. Maybe at least double that. My rating of Strange Fatality, The Battle of Stoney Creek, 1813, by James E. Elliott, 4.5, which is near classic status in terms of my rating system. But if you've read the book, what did you think, dear listener? The Battle of Beaverdams, the story of Thorold's battle in the War of 1812 by Donald Keith Dewar and Paul Hutchinson. Here, at long last, is my account of the Battle of Beaverdams, which took place on June the 24th, 1813, and was another American defeat. Today, the battle is largely remembered for the role of Canadian heroine Laura Secord, who traveled through enemy lines to warn the British of the impending American attack. This account of the battle will take the form of a review of the short book The Battle of Beaverdams, the story of Thorold's battle in the War of 1812 by area resident Donald Keith Dewar. I acquired a copy signed by the author somewhere in my travels, but I no longer have any idea of where or when. The 64-page booklet was produced by Slabtown Press in St. Catharines in 1996. But before we get to the book, what happened to Beaverdams? On June the 23rd, 1813, 600 U.S. troops under Lieutenant Colonel Charles B. Borsler were dispatched from the American base at Fort George to destroy a British supply base at Deceu's house, a substantial two-story stone building located in what is present-day Thorold, Ontario. The Americans will camp overnight in the village of Queenston before proceeding to their objective on the 24th. Over the years, the name Deceu, D-E-C-O-U, has been changed to Decew, D-E-C-E-W. Today you will find a Deceuville, Ontario, on Highway 3 near Cayuga, where John Deceu moved in 1834. And there is a Deceu Falls near Brock University. Now, I went to Brock for 4 years, but never got to the falls. Don't ask me why. I guess I never got past the Brock pub. Carlene Black Label, anyone? En route, the Americans were ambushed by native warriors, surrounded, and terrified of being massacred, surrendered, which, as documented by Dewar, is only partially true. As well, most accounts focus on the roles of Laura Secord and James Fitzgibbons, not on the native warriors that did the actual fighting against the U.S. troops. Dewar dedicates his little book, quote, to the Aboriginals who fought so bravely at the Battle of Beaverdams, end of quote. Interestingly, while some of the warriors came from the Six Nations, many came from Lower Canada, modern-day Quebec. The warriors were commanded by Captain Francois Dominique Ducharme, a scout and fur trader from the Montreal District, with overall command under Major Peter V. de Heron of the 104th New Brunswick Regiment. And, I must admit, I was not familiar with either soldier. Dewar gives a detailed explanation of the roads in the Niagara of 1813, partly to explain what happened, but also to be able to relate what occurred to present-day landmarks. He does this as his primary intention in writing was to provide local residents with a guidebook to the scene of the battle, but also to explain why the American troops left their initial route, the St. David's Road at the base of the escarpment, and instead climbed the escarpment to take the mountain road at the top, where they were ambushed. Dewar says this diversion has been a contentious point among historians, but he explains it by saying that the Americans were blocked when they discovered an ambush awaiting them at a place called Turney's Crossroads on the St. David's Road. Turney's Crossroads on the St. David's Road. The ambush was a feint designed to fool the Americans into climbing the escarpment and taking the mountain road, and walking into a narrow gully where an ambush had been prepared for them by native warriors under the command of Captain Ducharme, and walk into it they did. From other accounts of the battle, I'd formed the impression that the Americans had been quickly surrounded by the native warriors, panicked, and surrendered. But Dewar's account indicates that it was quite a spirited firefight that lasted for 3 hours. Finding their advance blocked, the Americans attempted to retreat to Fort George, only to find this route blocked as well. The Americans were exhausted, low on ammunition, and their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Borsler, had been wounded twice in the thigh. Enter James Fitzgibbons, protege of Isaac Brock and leader of an independent company of men from the 49th Regiment. Fitzgibbons convinces the Americans that they are surrounded by a much larger force of British troops and that their only protection lies in surrender. And so Borsler agrees, having first torn up his written orders to prevent them from falling into British hands. Dewar speaks highly of Borsler, describing him as a, quote, skilled, dedicated, and ambitious soldier in the regular army, end of quote. He thinks much less of self-styled Major Cyrenius Chapin, who he characterizes as a braggart and a liar who could not be trusted. Chapin is one of those interesting characters that surfaced during the War of 1812. He had formed a company of 50 raiders who roamed the Niagara, where their principal object appears to have been theft and the kidnapping of Canadian farmers. It was Chapin and his men who spotted the supplies at Deceu's house and proposed the raid, but Borsler thinks so little of the Major and his plan that he demands his orders to capture the house in writing. Chapin professes to have intimate knowledge of the area leading to the objective, but when the American force is confronted by the potential ambush at Turney's Crossroads, he admits to Borsler his complete ignorance of the locale. Dewar also believes that Chapin and his men may have been the Americans who accidentally betrayed the attack plans to Canadian heroine Laura Secord. Whoever they were, these Americans stopped at the Secord house to demand a free meal and discussed the proposed raid at table. The Secords determined to get a warning message to militia officer William Hamilton Merritt, but as James Secord was recovering from wounds received at the Battle of Queenston Heights, Laura was elected to go. After a grueling walk over a large part of today's Niagara region, Laura eventually relayed her intelligence to Fitzgibbons, and so entered Canadian history. As noted earlier, Dewar's professed purpose in writing this short book was to provide a guide for local residents. Sadly, many battle locations have disappeared, the actual battle site being excavated during the construction of the third and fourth iterations of the Welland Canal. Still, if you live in southern Ontario and are able to get your hands on a copy, you'd have an interesting day tracking down the various places where the battle took place and what it looks like today. Dewar also wanted to credit the native warriors who fought the battle. In the end, the British never fired a shot, and so he lists the number of warriors from each tribe and names those killed. He also provides a muster roll for the local militia involved in the battle. My rating for this short book is 4 out of 5. Alas, it might be hard to get your hands on a copy, as I think the publisher may no longer be in business. If anyone knows, please share your information in the comments. The Butcher's Bill? Dewar says that around 30 Americans were killed, with between 60 and 70 wounded, some of whom were scalped and killed by native warriors. 23 American officers, 487 men, and 30 militia were taken prisoner. The native warriors, who did all the fighting, suffered 15 killed and 25 wounded. If this is your first visit to 1812 channel, my name is Warren, and I'm your host. I'm not a historian, nor am I an expert on the War of 1812. Instead, I'm a student wishing to learn about the conflict. Each month for the roughly 3 years of the war, I will outline the major events, and I will also try, the motive word is try, I will also try to review a book on the war. Please consider subscribing. Let's start a community of people interested in discussing the War of 1812. Did I miss anything? Any errors? Then let me know in the comments below. When the barrage lifts, cheers.